Welcome to the Books and Letters podcast, where we explore the fullness of what it means to live as stewards of words in the modern world in an age dominated by fleeting trends and digital noise. Greetings, I'm Scott Postma, and today my guest is Joel Carini. Joel's a philosopher and a theologian pursuing a PhD in philosophy at St. Louis University. He previously earned his MA in philosophy at the University of Chicago and an MDiv at Westminster Theological Seminary. For his undergrad, he studied music and philosophy at Wheaton College, and he's married to Anna, and they have 3 young children. Welcome, Joel. Really glad to have you today.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm excited for our conversation today, and trying to think of what could we call this episode, and I thought something like recovering Christian humanism or recovering it in a fragmented age. And the reason I said that is because, I came across some of your writing on Substack and was really intrigued because I don't often hear people talk about Christian humanism. And we have some commonality, I think, also in wrestling with presuppositionalism. And so your Substack is the Natural Theologian. So maybe, I don't know, just for fun to start there, why do you call it Natural Theologian? What do we take away from that?
Yeah, these are great questions. Yeah, so the struggle with presuppositionalism, if you will, has been pretty major kind of catalyst for my thinking. Did my theological education at Westminster Seminary, kind of in their newly reasserted presuppositionalist phase in the mid-2010s. And so there was a very kind of strong emphasis on all our theology is going to come straight from the Bible, on the basis of Van Til's apologetics, and then to John Murray's radically non-speculative theology. It was going to come straight off the pages of Scripture. And there's a lot off the pages of Scripture. There's a lot of good there. But when that is sort of set against, as it was, everything else, philosophy, secular learning, secular ideologies, there's almost an absolute antithesis set up between the Bible and the world. Mm-hmm. And, I just mentioned I'll be talking to Keith Matheson soon. In his recent book about presuppositionalism, he kind of contrasts a qualified antithesis where you acknowledge, say, common grace or the natural law and that it's not totally obliterated, with an absolute antithesis where the unbeliever can know nothing. And he makes the point that to get Van Til's apologetic for all his protestations about common grace, it actually requires the absolute antithesis. Mm-hmm. And so in practice, that's what it is. And so to me, we just had this combativeness against worldly thinking and philosophy. And it's especially strange when Christians come in the crosshairs, as they do in Van Til's critiques. Aquinas chiefly, like this guy who wrote volumes and volumes of theology and volumes of scriptural commentary, is, leading people astray in these deep fundamental ways. C.S. Lewis, even Francis Schaeffer comes under Van Til's critique. And I kind of set myself the task of putting this whole thesis to the test. I would go read books that come from other perspectives. I'd read Aquinas, and then I would try to find secular thinkers who were saying things that were good. You might call them common grace insights. I might call them natural law insights or natural theology. And then the ultimate test was to go to a secular university and study philosophy, which I had the privilege to do right after Westminster. Got to go to the University of Chicago and kind of try to find what is the best secular philosophy that I can get my hands on that is, if not, it's not Christian apologetics per se. They're not trying to prove the resurrection, but they might be against scientism. They might be against materialism. They might support what I might call humanism. Like there's more to human reality than just our mechanical and material substrate. And I found flavors of that at the University of Chicago, where the philosophy department had an interplay of religious and non-religious thinkers, and all with a kind of perennial focus, going back to older thinkers. Anyway, there's plenty to dig into there. But as a result, in my writing, I'm working on a philosophy PhD. That's kind of my academics. There's no theology in there. Like it really is, Van Til would call it autonomous reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to figure out how much common ground is there between believers and unbelievers. My advisor's an unbeliever. But now for my kind of popular blog writing, I'm trying to put all these pieces together. And the natural theologian seems to sum up for me the idea of doing theology, yes, but open to the book of nature and not just the book of scripture.
Yeah.
And so that makes me not just a scriptural theologian or biblical theologian, but a natural theologian. And again, not just in the sense of only proofs for God's existence, but this openness to the book of nature broadly.
I love that, and I want to maybe unpack a few things you said. You said there's a lot to unpack there, and 100% agree. So many ways we could go with this, and so I love hearing your description. So let's back up one step and make just a real simple definition, because a lot of listeners here span a spectrum, a lot of intellectuals, and then some common folks are just love reading C.S. Lewis, together, that kind of thing. So I'm just wondering, could you give us just a real brief definition, Van Tillian presuppositionalism? That's a big mouthful. What does that mean? Just in simple layman's terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think Van Til's presuppositionalism fits in a broad stream of about half the Christian intellectual tradition that is more what you could say fideist. Mm-hmm. It is more faith against reason.
Yep.
Reason can lead us astray, so we need to go to the doctrines of faith, straight to the Bible, and believe without building up to there by reason, through natural theology or whatever. And Van Til kind of radicalizes that and spells it out in an intellectually rigorous way, giving it a theological foundation, basically in the doctrine of sin. Some would say the covenant, but like that sin has affected our mind and not just our will. And therefore, someone who is unregenerate, who the Holy Spirit has not converted, not only their will, but their mind is set against Christ. And so the idea that by just looking at nature, they're going to reason their way to God and be, 5 steps along the path to salvation, that sounds implausible. Like sin is going to be leading them, say, to want to indulge their passions, and so they take on a materialist worldview where there's no value or right and wrong, and they get to indulge their passions. So in response to that, Van Til says, we need a Christian worldview that starts from all and only specifically Christian premises. Mm-hmm. So these are going to come straight from the Bible. The doctrines of the Bible, and as a Reformed theologian, he thought that led to the doctrines of the Reformed Christian faith. And so all our reasoning needs to begin there. If you start from other presuppositions, you're going to be led astray. And what that really disallows is the idea that a Christian and a non-Christian can find a common starting point. That could be some philosophy, it could be observation of the world together without bringing our Christian bias or worldview to the table. So instead of finding some common ground with an unbeliever and trying to reason towards the faith, we have to confront the unbeliever that your presuppositions lead you astray and ultimately lead kind of to nowhere or to nihilism. Instead, kind of by seeing that, oh, I'm going to jump off the deep end if I follow materialist philosophy or postmodern philosophy, they are provoked to take a leap of faith into the circle of Christian interconnected beliefs. So, sorry, that wasn't quite like the bottom level layman's description, but it's basically, you got to start from Christian beliefs or you're not going to get any Christian beliefs.
Yeah. I think you did really well. And, just to maybe give that sort of background, and you feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, it's not somebody who's not a presuppositionalist or a classical apologist, or some of the other terms that are floating around there. I mean, classical apologist as opposed to a presuppositionalist, to make that clear for our audience. So the presuppositionalist says you need to abandon reason and just start from this presupposition that the Bible is true, without any real proof or thinking or reason to why it could be true. Whereas a classical apologist says, okay, let us reason together. So one is not saying the Bible's unimportant, is simply saying that we need to get some common ground, and gives room for a kind of common grace. Now, I wonder how you would respond to this. So one of the things that and this might just be a sloppy application of it. I don't recall whether Van Til actually holds this position, but I've heard presuppositionalists refer, say, to Romans chapter 1, beginning verse 18, that unbelievers are suppressing the truth, and therefore that's why they have to start where you're at. And yet, when I read that, thinking, you use the term the book of nature and the book of scripture, and I think of Galileo and his, his use of that phrase. What it seems to me that Paul is saying is it's those who reject the book of nature outright. Like when you look and see that this deitistic possibility is there, to reject that is to suppress the truth. It's not referring to scripture per se, but rather to a kind of natural revelation itself. Would you agree or disagree, or do I have that wrong?
Yeah, I think that's completely correct. Now, there are Van Tillian kind of workarounds, and it really all comes down to what I'd really like to see is like a worked out philosophy of self-deception. I'm sure somebody's done this. Because the thing about self-deception is you're both the deceiver and the deceived.
Yeah.
So you do know on one level. And Van Til has this. He has we have like psychological knowledge of God. It's back there in our psychology somewhere, but no epistemological. No knowledge that you actually know. And I think to myself, there's not knowledge that's not knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm pushing down a beach ball, I can, pretend I don't know it's there. I can have forgotten it, sort of, because it's way under the surface. But at some physical level, I'm pressing it down. I'm aware of its existence, even if it's back in the subconscious, which I totally grant. The whole point of doing natural theology is to bring it back to the surface.
Right.
It's not that every unbeliever out there already knows Aquinas' 5 proofs. It's that the sort of foundations of these are accessible to people. And so, yeah, I read Romans 1 and I see the presupposition of being able to suppress the truth is that you have access to that truth.
Yeah.
So people are accountable for something that is revealed in nature. And the presuppositionalist attempt is to it's sort of like a priori saying, just there's no way that they're going to figure it out. And it's if it's there, it's possible that they see it. Because look, sin is not perfect. Sin is an accident with respect to nature, to go kind of Aristotelian. God made us a certain way. He implanted us with certain capacities. Whatever sin and suffering and the defect of our nature do, they don't obliterate that. They don't destroy it. If you take the phrase total depravity and think it means that, it's wrong. So there are enormous noetic effects of sin, but they are not absolute.
Right.
And, there are some people for whom it starts to break through. And that's something I've just seen more and more, especially since my time in seminary, with Jordan Peterson and the whole intellectual tradition coming out of him, of originally secular people starting to see aspects of the Christian faith. It's more and more obvious to me that, yes, there are lots of noetic effects of sin, but there's also the light of nature peeking through.
What you're describing, a lot of the early Christian apologists, describe these as the virtuous pagans, right? Going back to you referenced Aristotle and accidents versus essence, um, and so what even Justin Martyr, as an example, so we're second century, who is arguing, and St. Augustine follows up with this idea that whatever good is in these virtuous pagans, this thing that's shining through, is logos. It is because they are, they're viewing some aspect of the logos, even if they don't have the complete revelation of it. They are seeing, something that's true, and this is an extension. This is common grace. So even our early Christian fathers, the patristics and apologists, throughout history, you've already mentioned Aquinas, coming all the way up, recognized, and even go to the Reformed faith, true theologians understand total depravity doesn't mean complete, utter depravity. It means that it's affected everything. Doesn't mean we're all as depraved as we possibly could be. So there's there's a lot of, I think, misleading applications or understandings of these things without getting in and reading back. So I really feel like your thoughts here are helpful. So in your on your Substack here, the Natural Theologian, you talk about Christian humanism, and I love that term for a lot of reasons, and have written about it, and I did much of my doctoral dissertation on Christian humanism. So I'm interested to hear, from you what, in light of where you have just unpacked, what is a Christian humanist? What does that mean for a natural theologian?
Yeah, it's obviously going to be similar. Like I'm throwing out two different slogans, but they are deeply related.
Yeah,
I think Christian humanist is broader in some sense, in that I think it's something like lots of people doing different things with their lives can do. Like you can adopt a certain approach. So what is that approach? I just got to interview the Reformation historian Bruce Gordon recently about Zwingli. Got his book here, and that was kind of one of the inspirations for this. Actually, that was the inspiration for this recent kind of series on humanism. And he just defined simply, like, he said his students, he teaches at Yale. Okay, his students, we both know that in every evangelical church, also, the word humanist just sounds like something secular and godless. That's what people think it means.
Yeah.
And people think I'm like making up a new version of this word. When I use it in this way, it's like, no, this is the actual meaning. We're not just going to give this to T.H. Huxley or whoever it was in the 19th century who stole the word humanists for the atheists. Humanist meant, Dr. Gordon was talking about at the Renaissance and the Reformation, somebody who was a man of letters and studied the classics. That's what it meant. You were recovering pagan learning. In context of Christian civilization, it meant that you thought there was stuff to learn outside the Bible, outside just the specifically Christian tradition. And of course, as we've mentioned, the Christian tradition had many examples of this. Augustine, Jerome, Clement of Alexandria, Boethius, just on and on. Yeah. There's been lots of Christians trying to take in the secular philosophy. They might not have called it secular, but they might have called it pagan. That's almost worse. So they were taking in these outside sources of learning and figuring out how it fit or didn't fit with the Christian faith, as the case may be. And so for me, I'm kind of thinking, what is the contemporary application of that? Obviously, if somebody's at Hillsdale studying classics and they're a Christian, well, they're well on the way to being a Christian humanist.
Right.
I think it can and ought to be broader too. Like I've taken up the discipline of analytic philosophy, which isn't just Thomism and Aristotelianism. It's sometimes in conflict with it, but the point is being open to other kinds of learning that aren't just based in the Bible. And the humanist part of that is this idea that the pursuit of truth is a common human enterprise. Mm-hmm. Not that everyone's, headed in exactly the right direction or has happened upon the truth, but that this isn't something that Christians are like uniquely doing. If I want to find wisdom about the way the world works, if I want to understand how politics works, I should probably read Aristotle. I should probably read the American founding fathers. I should probably read the early modern political philosophers. I should probably read Nate Silver on Substack and, just contemporary political science and data and stuff. Like this idea that if I want to understand the world as a Christian, large aspects of that are common to believer and unbeliever. They're common human projects and interests. As Aristotle said, all people desire the good, but also all people's minds are ordered to the true in principle. So I think that's kind of what Christian humanism is. I mean, you could think of great slogans like all truth is God's truth. And the idea of the book of nature that, or plundering the Egyptians, all these phrases, or even just common grace. I think it has its problems, but common grace is a way of recognizing that there's great stuff out there. I just want to insist that it's not just from grace, it's also from human nature. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of what I take Christian humanism to be. It's obviously exemplified in like classical education and these things, but it can be Christians in other fields of learning as well.
Yeah, I think that was a wonderful explanation. I think the scary thing for a lot of people is what you mentioned at the very beginning, is that it's a term that Abraham Kuyper might call it cut flower. That it was the secularists have taken the bloom and left the root, and not recognized that a lot of the human accomplishments in Western civilization come because of incarnational thinking, but the ability to collaborate with those who aren't believers, and I before I go on to the next statement, I almost didn't finish my thought, but the ability to collaborate is that, like you said, incomplete, but I think helpful understanding of common grace, that common human element. We're first humans. Ian Zimmerman says, we're first humans and then we're Christians, right? And sometimes I think what happens is we get that backwards, and that presuppositionalist sort of attitude is we start with Christianity, and what that does is that pits us against all other humans. It's kind of a polemic sort of attitude versus more of an ironic spirit of, where do we agree and where do we see we're going off and why, and so Christianity does have purchase on culture, and I think it has, the strongest, argument for human flourishing, and yet we as Christians who are truly rooted in our Christianity believe that coercion would be a wrong approach to Christianity. Wouldn't be any Christianity at all, right? And so there must be a kind of what Augustine would call St. Augustine called a liminality, this recognized shared space between the city of God and the city of man, where we cooperate for human flourishing, all the way across the board. So just kind of reiterating some of the things you said there. And I do appreciate you also mentioned the fact that, Christian humanism can be applied in so many ways. It certainly begins with this idea of education, but I would call C.S. Lewis. Lee Oser has written quite extensively on the 20th century Christian humanists, Flannery O'Connor, G.K. Chesterton, Tolkien, Lewis, who are human in their endeavors, and rooted in a true Christianity. Anything to add there before I?
Sure. No, I think it's helpful to add the Lewis and kind of Tolkien element in, because I've given a kind of very scholarly sounding version of it, but I do think there's also long been there's some contrast between humanist and more kind of academic, tippy top of the ivory tower. Like a humanist tends to be a bit more literary. Zwingli, I feel a commonality because he was a musician. The guy could play like 12 instruments. He didn't get rid of the organs because he hated music. So like in Lewis and Tolkien, by using literature, what I think is really important there, especially Tolkien, because of his opposition to allegory, is that he didn't want to ever lead with the Christianity. He wanted to lead with what was common and what could sort of lure people along. Like you read his On Fairy Stories. Like in the end, he's saying, this is going to lead you to Christ. But he's saying, I'm not going to tell you where it's going to lead, though. I'm not going to force it. And I think that's exactly what you're saying about force.
Mm-hmm.
Like the attempt to sort of force Christianity on people is a tacit acknowledgement that Christianity isn't compelling enough to a human being or enticing enough. And so, enforcing Christianity by the sword has a lot in common with like the first time you meet somebody saying, "Hi, I'm a Christian. Would you like to change religions?"
Right.
Which is, the caricature of a common evangelical like feeling like that's how we're supposed to relate to Christians, is like, how quick can I get to evangelism?
Right.
As opposed to, could I be human alongside you? Could I tell a really compelling story and not tell you where it leads, but sort of start walking with you in the right direction?
What you just reminded me of, I love that example. That was framed so well, because in the early 2000s, there were a lot of these evangelical movies made by a couple of different, filmmakers, but
Yeah.
they were kind of a bait and switch sort of thing. Like, hey, get your friends to come to this Christian movie. And all it was basically a setup. The whole storyline was shallow and engineered basically to present the gospel, in that very Roman roads, here's the 5 steps or 4 spiritual truths, or whichever approach they used. And it just made Christianity, in its sense, become kind of cheesy, instead of it having substance in and of itself that needed to be propped up, I guess. I don't know, but the way you framed it just a moment ago reminded me of that.
I call that a Jesus juke.
Yeah, a Jesus juke. Okay.
It's like you're leading somebody along one way, and then you're like, Jesus, come over here.
This is what it's all about. Well, if we believe, if we go even all the way back, I'm always, it always fascinates me, I guess, that John opens his gospel with the Logos, and that he's really appealing to a culture, in his biography, if you will, in his Gospel of Christ. But he's opening with this commonality, because that whole picture of the Logos is that thing that we have inherited, in the Word, right? And not just, he's the Word, but in our words, so storytelling, poetry, human beings are storytellers, and so it's something very human, to recognize that we do have that commonality that we share in Christians and non-Christians, and not everybody's going to see it right away. So we share that commonality that can lead us, to honest conversations at, an appropriate place.
Yeah.
So what would you say? I'm kind of curious, maybe to take this a little bit of different. So what would you say Christian humanism offers then? We talked a little, you said, the academy, it can kind of be stuffy. What does it offer culture? What does it offer even in the political arena? And I'm wondering, we don't have to go directly to the politics, but that seems to be such a big conversation today, probably in the last decade. And not to set the conversation up too hard, but I would think that Christian humanism starts a little bit upstream from that. But I'm wondering, how would you think in terms of its purchase on, the academy, culture, politics, any of those arenas?
Yeah. So starting with culture, and like kind of broadly, one obvious starting place is the idea that we want to do what is commonly human instead of just what is specifically Christian. So some basic fundamental examples, in the 90s, there was a band called Earthsuit, inspired by a sermon about how our physical bodies are just an earth suit and we're going to lose them someday. Good old Gnostic message. And these guys didn't really get off the ground. However, a couple years later, they had a change of mind and they changed their name. They became not officially a Christian band anymore, and they were called Mute Math. And they became a very successful rock band. And I haven't listened to the Earthsuit days, but the Mute Math days are very good. And they were even less known than like Reliant K or Switchfoot as like, oh, they're a Christian band. Like they just had a vibe of, we're just a band. We just make good music. And there's your rock band example. But like beyond that, if you were an aspiring Christian movie maker, why would you think what I really need to do is make Christian movies? It's like, think like Tolkien. Okay, what are the stories I can think back? Like, what movies have made me like think like I have just seen the gospel? Okay, there's the Will Smith one with zombies. I forget what this is called. It's like the post-apocalyptic world, and at the end, he like gives his life to save his son, I think. Yeah. And I remember just like crying after that, like, this is the gospel. And then the other one, I'm a big fan of musicals, is Les Mis. Like, I love the movie version too, and that one always makes me cry at the end, because all these figures who have died, and they gave their life for, you know, the leftist revolution. So, you know, but who cares about the details, the political details of the story? The story is one, in the end, it kind of represents resurrection and like hope. And why not make a movie like that? I'm sure there are plenty of obstacles to becoming a conservative Christian, like big box office Hollywood producer. However, in principle, thinking this way, okay, so for me, that has meant when I get interested in philosophy, I'm like, I don't just want to be like the uber Christian philosopher who just thinks about kind of Christian religious topics, which there are plenty of those. Some of them are using like extremely great intellectual talents to parse out the details of God and the Christian faith. Like, kudos to them. However, I wanted to apply this by like, can I study something that's more like neutral and a bit more, I'm doing a dissertation on the philosophy of language. So it's a little bit more like if somebody becomes a linguist, like that's not a specifically Christian topic, but they are learning about the way the world works with respect to language. And so, okay, just broadly, in Christians' cultural good works, let's say, our sort of transformational activities, these don't have to be specifically Christian. They can embody the good, the true, the beautiful in whichever domain. So then you're right, like this is upstream of politics. But okay, now we come to kind of the political dimension, which we must. Like, that is a real part of life. And, you know, to take the Anabaptist retreat from politics in America, I've come to see more and more, just doesn't make sense. Like, there's like half of American politics professes to be Christian, and it crosses the aisle. And so, like, we're in the position of post-Constantine. It's like, oh wait, the Christians have power. We actually have to think about what to do with this.
Yeah.
So going back to what you were saying about force, and you know, I think what I've come to, let me come at it this way. So one of my inspirations for getting into the natural law, that whole area of theology and then of philosophy, because there are natural law philosophers, was John Rawls' idea of public reason. So Rawls is like the big theorist of contemporary liberalism. And I mean, only with a very small L am I a liberal. But one of his ideas that I think is one of his best ideas is called public reason. That in a pluralistic democracy, when we have political debate and we're figuring out on what basis we should build our laws, what our laws should be, we should appeal to arguments and bases that are accessible to all citizens. So if we're in America and your argument for a policy comes down to a verse of the Quran, it's just like, this is America, guys. Like, it's not going to work that way. But also, if the Christian just does the Bible verse, you're not appealing to the conscience or the wisdom of your fellow citizen. So this doesn't mean not legislating any Christian morality or anything, but it does mean trying to be persuasive and like appeal to things that other people can understand and agree with. I think Christians often assume that there's less of that than there really is. But like, I know plenty of secular people who think that pornography isn't the best thing. It's, especially over the last decade, lots of secular people are concerned about like smartphones in general and just the idea of addictive digital replacements for the real world that suck us in. There's these secular men's movements online where they try to, go cold turkey for, as long as possible, you could say. So like, and that's kind of the Christian nationalist issue of the moment, if you will. So it's like okay, that's like political national level debate. Let's take politics down to the more mundane level. Neighbors on a street, like we can come to common ideas about how fast our speed limits should be based on how safe children should be and the trade-offs between getting places and being safe while we do it and so on. There's a lot of commonality. And I think that means our relationships with people across worldviews can just be a lot more positive, a lot more constructive than we originally think. But one thing that helps me like theologically with this is, watch out, here comes some Aquinas, like the preambles of faith versus the articles of faith, where he said, okay, there's like a number of things that Christianity teaches that are also there in nature.
Right.
So, Chesterton said original sin, there's actually a lot of empirical evidence for it. It's not just a dictate of faith dropped down from on high. So if you really parse it out, I think Scripture says that God exists, that we're made in his image, that there's a moral law, that we've broken that law, and that we're suffering on account of it. At least that stuff is kind of evident. That's our predicament.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, back to the suppressed beach ball. If people didn't know that, the gospel wouldn't even speak to them.
Right. Yeah.
Like you have to be even at some implicit level aware that that's kind of your predicament for the gospel to be offering you something that you would even care about. And so all that stuff, before we get to the Trinity and the incarnation and et cetera, is common territory and can be the basis for conversation across worldview differences in a political society like our own. Now, it's, you can't always put it in like Christianese, like, hey, neighbor, don't you know that there's original sin? No, you might have to say, don't you know that we're not all perfect? And so our laws should kind of make a little space for that. But also, people do a lot of bad things, so we do need laws. We need restraint. Anyway, there's different ways that we can kind of speak in common terms, on common ground, to get at the moral and political basis of our life together without jumping to specifically Christian beliefs.
Well, what I hear you unpacking, if I could put it in these terms, is really just in appeal to our common humanity, to rational public discourse about those things that we share in common. And I again, I'm going to go back to, you already mentioned Aquinas and the natural law theory that he unpacked so well, I think in questions 90 to 97 or something, that, but he, unpacks this understanding of law and politics. But we go even to, St. Augustine and that place of liminality where we coexist together, and there's a wisdom and eloquence in how we function and operate. But it seems in our modern context, and this is what's really interesting to me, is in our modern context, we've kind of retreated. Christians have retreated into sort of made Christianity almost an ideology that's a counterpoint. It's a polemic to some of the Marxist impulses that are out there, and so now we've got this, these things pitted against each other, and that isn't going to really solve anything. And so where Christians adopt a kind of Machiavellian or almost Nietzschean approach to how do we share life, and that really undermines, the regular, I'm gonna call it regular, traditional, historical, Christian, perspective of living in the world with other human beings who have not yet, come to the faith.
Yeah.
And I think, another point you made, working in your local community, I almost get the idea that sometimes people have this thing, if they're not a Christian, then they want no speed limits and go as fast as you can, doesn't matter how many kids get killed. Like, I mean, I'm being really dramatic there, but
implicitly,
yeah.
If they took it to its logical conclusion, that's where they would all end up.
Yeah, everybody's going to end up that way, and that's never really been the case. How would you say? I think we got a few minutes left here, but how would you say that a person could live out as a Christian humanist today? And I know you've given some ideas of how we need to look at the world. These common stories. If we get into the arts and things, was it Horace that said it's art to hide art, right? I mean, it's so the Christian idea of just telling a good story is itself a Christian thing. Oh, I know what I was going to say. It was Luther who, I believe it was Luther who said, you don't make Christian shoes by nailing little crosses to them, as sort of you make a good quality shoe and sell it at a fair price. And that's what a Christian cobbler should be. So how would we apply that? How could we think about being a Christian humanist in today's world, not retreating into this hyper, and that's not to reject, I don't know if I'm using the right terms here. We're not rejecting our Christianity, but we don't want to retreat into this kind of hyper Christianity, but where we can live in that common space and be a voice and influence, whatever we are. If we're a plumber, if we're an electrician, or or a writer, or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I think we could almost do no better than to follow the advice of a very grounded Catholic friend of mine who once told me, I made him read The Benedict Option by Rod Dreher, and his response was like, yeah, there's some good stuff in there, but don't be weird. I just live by that principle. Let's just not be weird. And it got to me because I'm thinking to myself, my whole sense of what it is to be a Christian was to be weird. Like, you're going to stand out. You're not going to be doing all the sin everybody else is doing. And that is, I want to affirm, a sort of moment of the Christian life. It might even be a phase of like, I do need to separate myself from the world. I need to stop, habitual sin. And like, I gotta get my mind separated from secular ideologies and the winds of every doctrine and so on. But what I'm kind of in the phase, I'm trying to teach people to be a Christian humanist, even if you've already been sort of a Christian presuppositionalist or a theology nerd, as I say, or whatever it is how can you become human again? How can you actually start to become like a normal human who has some of the same common interests as other people? And because I think that's so much more helpful for how to communicate with others, even eventually, like, not too fast, guys, like, hold your horses, eventually the gospel. But like, gospel will come best if you're already friends.
Yeah, right.
And so, for me, like, even recently, one way to become more human has been to watch more movies. Okay, like, young Christian guy, zealous, wants to get into academics. I cut out movies from my life. I was like, I'm a serious person. I don't do video games and movies and all this unserious entertainment. And now I'm reaching this point in life where I'm like, I really should just like know some basic stuff, and not just as like an evangelism launching point, but just like, I'm human too. I've been watching the Jurassic Park movies. Like, I'm human. I want to see a mega dinosaur on the silver screen. Like, come on. Just like recognizing I'm not different from everybody else in every single respect. I'm actually the same as them in so many respects because we're all made in the image of God. We all have a human nature. We are all suffering through this veil of tears. We are all afflicted by the disease of original sin, and so on. And that's, bit by bit, I'm trying to become a little bit less weird and a little bit more normal. And that itself makes room for like social interaction with non-Christians. And being somebody who, a friend of mine says that they can see the light in your eyes. Like the fact that you're a Christian is now, I get to be more human, not less human.
Right.
As I'm starting to think, like the great Christian hope is that we get to be human forever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like all this glorious stuff, like that's what I'm seeing at the end of those movies. It's like there's resurrection. Death is contrary to our nature. Peter Thiel is right about that. Like, yeah, transhumanism, not so much. But yeah, we want to be human forever and to enjoy bodily life and good food and drink, whatever the pleasures of heaven, the new heavens and new earth will be. So I think that just really helps, as opposed to thinking of your relationship to non-Christians in this antithetical way, as it's only Christianity against the world. It's like, what we really need to start with is like a sufficient understanding of just like both the doctrine of creation and the doctrine of sin. They're both there. Mm-hmm. Like we are created in God's image. It's not completely obliterated by the fall. And then something I've been digging into more recently, like, and on the sin side and how the fall has affected us, it's not just sin, it's also suffering. It's also misery. And that's something that, like, just as Boethius says that philosophy provides consolation, theology, the gospel, should provide consolation for real human needs and interests, not just, the proclivity of some for theological answers. Like, no, everybody wants the tears to be wiped from our eyes.
Right.
Everybody wants that. Well, Christianity offers that very physical human hope that, like, the sources of evil and suffering will one day be overcome. That is not a pie in the sky ethereal hope. That is a bodily, emotional, deeply human hope. And I think we can communicate that best to people if we're starting by truly being human ourselves. And I think we can be human and Christian. I think we can do it.
Well, what you just described is very hopeful to me in that, it is our Christianity that gives us, the foundation to be fully human. And so you mentioned earlier a kind of Christian Gnosticism that seems to be prevalent, I think, in probably a lot more dispensational context, but in a lot of Christian thinking is, that we're just here on this little temporary journey, and one day you use the band about I can't remember the name of it,
the Earth suit.
Yeah, the Earth suit. We're going to get rid of this, and we're going to be in some sort of esoteric spiritual state. But it's the resurrection of the body that's the blessed hope, right? I mean, so we are going to be human forever, and that's rooted in the incarnation. And so we really have it. I know that some of the Renaissance humanists were critiqued for some of this, and maybe some of them even stretched it a little bit. But still, this whole idea that we are fully human, even going back to Irenaeus, he said that the glory of God is a living human being, meaning a flourishing human being. This is what God.
Yeah.
This is what God did for us. So to kind of retreat into our Christianity, so to say, and make that antithetical against the world really is kind of anti-Christian. It is sort of not being flourishing as the human being that God saved us to be and is working out, for his glory and for our flourishing. And so I really appreciate that. Just be more normal and and be less weird. And just be a human being flourishing and walking in wisdom. So, well, any final thoughts? Because maybe there's something that you would like to talk about that I didn't bring up. I really wanted to kind of, get to know you a little bit through this conversation and hear from you. And sometimes when you're working in these little corners like Christian humanism, you don't meet a lot of people. And so, am I the weird one out here, or other people
Yeah.
thinking about this? But maybe there's something you'd like to talk about or mention, or something that's on your mind. And if not, that's fine. But if there was anything, I'd be happy to hear from you. Anything that's important.
Yeah, I mean, just on kind of what you're saying, like, I do find that people are very interested in this kind of idea, and I think it crosses some of the lines.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it's appealing to people on both the Christian right and the Christian left, for example. I think we should open ourselves up to this in a certain way. So, like, when I talk about these things, and there's a kind of anti-Gnostic, anti-fundamentalist vibe to that appeals to people on the Christian moderate to left, where
Mm-hmm.
they've felt like evangelical Christianity for a few decades, or if not a century, has been pretty anti-world to an excessive degree. And like a lot of the time, that's what people who are kind of going in that direction are concerned about. Like, I've even seen, I read this too, like Aaron Wren talk about the beginning of Tim Alberta's book, which is kind of like this, Washington Post writer's screed against evangelicalism. It's more than that, because it starts with like Christians coming after him for his politics at his father's funeral.
Mm.
And you're like, oh my goodness, guys, like, save your Rush Limbaugh for other days of the week. Not the guy who said a few liberal things on his father's funeral. Okay. But on the flip side, like, I think that the kind of classical Christian, natural law, resurgent Christian right is being humanist in very important senses. Like, I think we need, what New St. Andrews and Hillsdale and these places are doing. We need bookshelves like yours and mine that, don't exactly peg us as progressives, but like we need, there's something that crosses these divides. It's appealing to, I was thinking before we were speaking, I didn't know how much to get into this, but like, a lot of people think Doug Wilson is just crotchety right-wing guy. And the most appealing things to me about Doug Wilson have been like, the guy plays the guitar. He's really jolly. He reads P.G. Wodehouse, which I have started to read like all the time. And he swears when he's talking to Christopher Hitchens. Like, there's weirdness, and the mainstream media picks out the weirdness, but the guy's also very human. Okay, so just like there's an emblematic figure. It's just like, I think people on all sides of kind of Christianity, kind of looking at the last several decades, are like, things have gone wrong in multiple directions. But I think something I see as common across these responses is that Christianity does need to be more human. It can't just be finger wagging about the truth or about moral rules. Like, it has to be that we've got a better way of life. We really have something better to offer as, fully living as humans. So I guess that's kind of my extra thing, is that if you want to be a Christian humanist, kind of get over the hump between evangelical left and evangelical right a bit, which I know can be difficult to do. Because I think if you're a Christian humanist, you probably think about the specifics of politics, and you probably come to a strong opinion. But still, this kind of cultural backlash against the anti-human and the legalism and the fundamentalism of the last several decades, I think there's a common thread there of Christianity does need to be more human and affirming of the good in the world, and so on. So that's kind of my...
That's great. That's a wonderful conclusion to it. I was going to say this earlier, and I kind of got distracted and forgot to, but I think it was Mark Greif. I'm not positive. He's a professor at Stanford. I think it was him that I'd read, but he talked about that humanism always resurfaces during national or political breaches, like where there's a big divide in a culture. There, humanism always seems to sort of recover that middle ground. Some people call it a moderate or whatever, but really what it is a recovery of the human, because what you just talked about, these right and left wing sort of divides that we see all over the news. When I sit down and have a beer with my neighbor and we're just talking about, what's happening in our little town or our place, and they may be completely on the other side of the fence from where I am politically, we still share common concerns about our kids, about the neighborhood, or about whatever is going on. Those are just normal human things that we have in common, and those always seem to be the topic of conversation. And there is this real connection that even if we talk about religion or politics comes up, we have that shared sort of human place. And and so I think a lot of that you talked about, we have to kind of jump over, would require us to kind of step back and say, a lot of this sort of incited hostility, I think, has roots in media and other things, but also in some historic antithetical ideas that have been kind of enculturated into this generation of Christians that you just mentioned. So anyway, I just my affirmation of what you said. Well, Joel, thank you so much. I mean, honestly, this has been great. I hope maybe we can even talk again in the future. Lots of other ideas that we can unpack, but this seems like a really good foundation. For our audience, if you have questions, I'm going to have show notes or links to Joel's Substack and other works and things in the show notes. And so come by, check out his work. If you have questions, feel free to hit either of us up, and we'll be happy to answer questions. Joel, thanks again.
You bet. I also do have a book form of my ideas, kind of based on my Substack. I don't know if that came into focus. Probably didn't.
The Natural Theologian.
Natural Theologian.
Is that yours?
Yeah, that's my book. So check that out on Amazon or whatever as well.
Fabulous. I'll throw the notes to, or the link to that book in the show notes as well. Perfect.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me. Great discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, Joel.